Hello, my name is Kevin Alvarado, and my presentation is on the Spanish and U.S. colonization in the Philippines. For this presentation, I'm looking at one main question. How did Spain and the United States use different methods of colonial control in the Philippines? And how did both empires shape the development of the modern Filipino nation? My argument is that Spanish and American rule look different on the surface, but were both systems of imperial control. Spain ruled mainly through Catholic conversion, missionary authority, tribute, forced labor, and the reorganization of local communities. The United States ruled through English language education, bureaucracy, political tutelage, and the claim that Filipinos needed to be trained for self-government. So the point is not just that Spain and the United States colonized the Philippines. The main point is that each empire changed Filipino society in a different way. Spain shaped religion, local life, and community authority. The United States shaped education, language, bureaucracy, and political institutions. Together, these colonial systems helped shape the modern Philippines. But Filipinos were not passive in that process. They resisted, adapted, and transformed these colonial inheritances into part of their own national history. The overview. The image on this slide is Intramos, the old Spanish walled city in Manila. I chose this image because it connects the colonial past to the modern Philippines. Intramos is not just an old historical site. It is a physical reminder that colonial rule shaped space, architecture, religion, government, and memory. Even today, when people visit Intramos, they are walking through a place built around Spanish colonial power. My method for this presentation is a historical comparison. I am comparing Spanish and American rule by looking at their main tools of control. For Spain, these tools included the Catholic Church, missionary authority, tribute, forced labor, and local colonial administration. For the United States, those tools included public education, English, bureaucracy, political tutelage, and colonial government. This presentation covers the who, what, when, where, why, and how of the topic. The who includes Spain, the United States, Filipino communities, missionaries, local elites, and the American officials. The what is the colonization of the Philippines. The timeline begins with Spanish colonization in 1565. This shifts to the American control in 1898 and continues to independence from the U.S. rule in 1946. The where is the Philippines archipelago, especially Manila and Intramos, as major centers of colonial authority. The why is Spain's justification, its rule through religion and conversion, while the United States justified its rule through education, modernization, preparation for self-government. The how is the main focus of the presentation. Spain worked through churches and local elites, while the United States worked through schools, bureaucracy, and political institutions. The main findings is that Spain and the United States used different strategies, but both claimed to improve Filipinos while limiting Filipino sovereignty. This matters because colonialism did not only affect the past, it shaped religion, language, education, political institutions, and national identity in ways that are still visible today. The Philippines before colonization. The map on this slide shows the Philippines as an archipelago before it became one colonial territory. Before Spanish rule, there was no unified nation called the Philippines. The name itself came from Spanish colonization and was connected to King Felipe II, or Philip II, of Spain. Vincent Raphael explains that before Spanish conquest, there was no single political entity called the Philippines. So, in that sense, the Philippines, as one named colonial space, was partly created through Spanish Empire. Before colonization, the islands were made up of many communities with their own leaders, languages, customs, beliefs, and trade relationships. One important local unit was the barangay. Many barangay were led by a datu, who held authority through kingship, loyalty, wealth, and leadership ability. Pearson describes the barangay as the basic pre-Spanish unit of society, and the datu as the local figure who exercised political and social authority within that structure. This matters because it pushes back against a common colonial idea that colonizers brought civilization to people who had no order or history. That is inaccurate. The islands had already had social organization, leadership, trade, culture, and local authority. Communities were also connected to surrounding Asian regions, including China and other parts of Southeast Asia, through trade and exchange. So this slide gives the before context. Spanish colonization did not create society in the islands. It renamed, reorganized, converted, and governed communities that already existed. Understanding this pre-colonial context is important because it shows that colonization was not the beginning of the Philippine history. It was the beginning of a new colonial structure, placing over existing societies. When Spanish colonization begins. The church image on this slide represents one of the most important tools of Spanish colonial rule, Catholicism. I chose this image because Spanish power in the Philippines was not only military or political, it was also religious, cultural, and social. Churches were not just places of worship, they became centers of authority, education, ritual life, and community organization. Spanish colonization began in 1565. Before the beginning, Spain joined military conquest with Catholic conversion. Spain wanted control over land and labor, but it also wanted to transform people spiritually. Raphael explains that Spanish conquest involved both political submission and religious transformation. Spain wanted to control bodies through colonial authority, but also souls through Catholic conversion. That is why missionaries became so powerful. In many towns, the missionary priest was the most visible Spanish authority. Missionaries studied local languages so they could preach more effectively. They supervised religious education, organized feast days, helped direct church construction, and shaped community life. The church became one of the main ways of colonial authority and how it entered everyday life. This also helps explain how Spain was able to rule for so long despite the small number of Spaniards living in the islands. Spanish rule did not depend only on the soldiers. It depended on priests, churches, local elites, tribute, forced labor, and the reorganized communities. Catholicism helped make colonial authority part of the daily routine. Family life, rituals, and moral expectations. So the key point of this slide is that Spanish colonization was not only about taking territory, it was about reshaping society through religion. The church image really matters because it shows how Spanish Empire became visible in the landscape and in people's daily lives. The effects of Spanish rule. The map of Intramos and Manila works well for this slide because maps show how colonial power organizes space. A colonial map is not just neutral geography, it shows centers of authority, streets, churches, military spaces, districts, and the way a colonial government understands and controls territory. I use this image here because Spanish rule affected more than just religion. It also changed government, labor, social hierarchy, and urban space. One major effect of Spanish rule was the spread of Catholicism. Catholicism became one of the strongest and longest lasting legacies of Spanish colonization. It shaped religious life, festivals, education, morality, family practices, and the community identity. In many parts of the Philippines, the church became the center of town life. Another major effect was the reorganization of local leadership. Spain did not completely erase local elites. Instead, it used them. Pearson explains that the Spanish retained the basic barangay structure and turned it into the smallest unit of local government. The Datu became known as the Cabeza de Barangay. The local elites helped carry out Spanish policies. This is important because colonialism often works by transforming existing systems. Local leaders who once held authority inside their communities became intermediaries between the Spanish colonial state and the local population. They helped collect tribute, organize forced labor, and enforce colonial demands. In return, they would get to keep certain statuses and certain privileges. Forced labor was also a major part of Spanish rule. Raphael explains that native men were required to work on projects such as roads, churches, ships, and government buildings. This labor supported both the colonial state and the Catholic Church. It also shows how Spanish power demanded the labor of colonized people. So the effects of Spanish rule were layered. Catholicism reshaped belief and culture. Tribute and forced labor supported colonial administration. local elites became part of the colonial governments. Manila and Intramuros became centers of Spanish authority. These changes helped create long-term effects on religion, politics, labor, class relations, and identity. The transition to U.S. rule. This image of naval warfare, specifically the Battle of Manila Bay, it is important because the transition from Spanish to American rule came through war. American rule in the Philippines was later justified through education and modernization, but it began through war and imperial negotiation. The key event was the Treaty of Paris, signed in 1898. Through this treaty, Spain seceded the Philippines to the United States. This was one of the most important turning points in Philippine history because Filipinos had already been fighting Spanish rule and pursuing independence. Their struggle did not simply disappear when Spain lost the war. Instead, they found themselves facing a new colonial power. The Philippines was transferred from one colonial power to another. That shows how imperial powers treated the islands as a possession. The decision was made by Spain and the United States, not by the Filipino people as a whole. Punzulan explains that the Treaty of Paris transferred Spanish colonial authority over the Philippines to the United States, including colonial records and administrative control. That means the transfer was not only military, it was also legal, archival, and institutional. The United States had to justify why it was ruling a people who had already been colonized for more than 3 centuries and who were already fighting for independence. This is where the language of benevolent assimilation became important. The United States presented itself as a helpful and modernizing power. It claimed that it would educate Filipinos, prepare them for self-governments, and guide them towards democracy. But that language also worked as a justification for continued control. The United States placed Spanish rule, but it did not immediately recognize full Filipino independence. The ruler changed, the language changed, and the institutions changed, but the Filipinos remained under foreign control. American rule in the Philippines. This image shows William H. Taft in his Manila office. Taft served as the first American civil governor of the Philippines, and the office setting fits the character of U.S. rule because American colonial power often worked through administration, commissions, paperwork, laws, reports, schools, and bureaucratic planning. This slide focuses mainly on the justification of American rule. The United States often presented itself as different from Spain. American officials claimed that they were not simply conquering the Philippines, they claimed they were preparing Filipinos for self-government. This idea is known as political tutelage. Tutelage means training or guidance. In this case, the United States imagined itself as the teacher and the Filipinos as the students who had to be trained before they could govern themselves. That idea may sound less violent than direct conquest, but it is still placed the United States in control. If Filipinos were described as not ready, then American rule could be presented as necessary. Political tutelage was both an educational claim and a colonial argument. Pico's work is useful here because he analyzes U.S. justification rhetoric. He argues that the United States had to frame colonization as something moral, helpful, and necessary. Education became one of the main ways the U.S. justified its rule, because it allowed American officials to claim they were preparing Filipinos for modern citizenship rather than simply controlling them. American rule also created political institutions and trained Filipino elites, but those institutions still operated inside a colonial framework. So even when American rule used words like democracy, education, and progress, it still limited Filipino sovereignty. The key points on this slide is that American colonialism often presented itself as help, but that language of help also became a way to maintain authority. The effects of American rule. The American era school building is one of the strongest images in the presentation because education was one of the clearest tools of the U.S. colonial power. The image represents a major shift from church-centered Spanish rule to school-centered American rule. This slide focuses more on the effects of American rule. Under the United States, English language public education expanded across the islands. This had long-term effects on language, government, social mobility, and public life. English became connected to schooling, government work, social mobility, and access to colonial institutions. Education did more than teach students how to read and how to write. It taught political values, ideas about citizenship, discipline, labor, hygiene, and modern government. In that sense, the classroom became a colonial space. It was where Filipinos were taught not only a new language, but also a way of understanding progress, citizenship, and modernity. American rule also shaped political institutions. The United States created and supervised government structures that trained Filipino leaders and elites. These institutions gave some Filipinos political experience, but that experience happened under U.S. supervision. This created a complicated form of nationalism. Filipino nationalism did not disappear under American rule. Instead, it continued and adapted inside the colonial system. Abagnales describes this as Filipino colonial nationalism. That phrase is useful because it shows that nationalism and colonialism were not completely separate. Filipino political identity developed inside institutions shaped by American rule, where even Filipinos continued to push towards independence. So the effects of American rule were deep and long-lasting. The United States reshaped education, language, bureaucracy, political leadership, and public life. It claimed to prepare Filipinos for independence, but it also strengthened U.S. influence over Filipino society. Comparing Spanish and American rule. The Spanish and U.S. flags make the comparison visually clear. These were two different empires with different symbols, languages, institutions, and justifications, but both ruled the same archipelago and both reshaped Filipino society. The biggest difference is the method of control. Spain relied more on Catholic conversion, missionary authority, tribute, forced labor, and local elites. Spanish rule worked through churches, priests, rituals, and community reorganization. The missionary priest was powerful because he influenced religion, education, moral behavior, and local life. The United States relied more on education, English, bureaucracy, political tutelage, and modernization. Instead of saying Filipinos needed Catholic conversion, American officials said Filipinos needed training for self government. Instead of missionaries being the central agent of rule, teachers, administrators, and political officials became that central. But the similarities between Spain and the United States is just as important as the differences. Both empires claimed they were helping Filipinos. Spain claimed to bring Christianity and salvation. The United States claimed to bring education, democracy, and modern government. But both claims made colonial rule appear moral and necessary. This is the deeper comparison. Spain claimed to save souls, while the United States claimed to train citizens. Spain used religion as the main language of authority, while the United States used education, modernization. But both systems reduced Filipino sovereignty by arguing that Filipinos needed imperial guidance. The main finding is that Spain and the United States used different institutions, but both turned claims of improvement into tools of control. That finding is important because it shows that colonialism does not always look the same, but it can work through churches, schools, armies, laws, maps, archives, and even the language of progress. Lasting legacy. The Philippine coat of arms works well really here because it represents the modern Philippine state. This slide is about legacy, state formation, and national identity. It helps show that colonial history did not simply end when colonial rule ended. It became part of the institutions, symbols, and contradictions of the modern state. The legacy of Spanish and American rule is that the modern Philippines developed through overlapping empires. Spanish rule shaped Catholicism, local government, community life, class relationships, and religious culture. The American rule shaped English language education, bureaucracy, political institutions, and ideas about citizenship and democracy. Vincent Raphael phrases imperial artifact. It is important because it captures the main point of this presentation. The modern Philippines was shaped through layers of empire, resistance, adaptation, and nation building, not through one single colonial experience. That does not mean Filipinos had no agency. Filipinos resisted, adapted, negotiated, and transformed colonial systems. But many of these institutions they inherited were still shaped by empire. This legacy is complicated because colonial inheritances are not just leftovers. Filipinos transformed them into part of national life. Catholicism can be understood as colonial inheritance, but it is also a major part of Filipino identity today. English came through American colonial rule, but it also became a language used by Filipinos in education, government, work, and global communication. Political institutions were shaped under American supervision, but Filipinos also used those institutions to argue for independence and nationhood. This is why colonial legacy cannot be explained in a simple way. It is not just that Spain and the United States imposed these things, and Filipinos just accepted them. Filipinos lived within these systems, resisted them, changed them, and made them part of national life in different ways. So the lasting legacy is layered. The modern Philippines cannot be understood without looking at Spanish Catholic influence, American education and political influence, and Filipino agency in responding to both. In conclusion, the modern Manila skyline brings us back to the present. The earlier images showed maps, churches, war, colonial officials, schools, flags, and state symbols. This final image shows the modern Philippines. It connects the historical material to the world that exists today. The main conclusion here is that the Spanish and U.S. colonization used different methods, but both were reshaping the Philippines in a lasting way. Spain relied on Catholic conversion, missionary, authority, tribute, forced labor, and local community reorganization. The United States relied on English language education, bureaucracy, political tutelage, and administrative reform. Spain represented itself as bringing Christianity and salvation. The United States presented itself as bringing education, democracy, modernization, but both empires used these ideas to justify control over the Philippines. The most important takeaway is that colonialism did not only shape and change who governed the Philippines. It shaped religion, language, education, labor systems, class relationships, archives, political institutions, nationalism, and identity. It affected how Filipinos were governed and how Filipinos came to understand themselves as a people. This topic matters because the effects of colonialism is still visible in everyday life and national institutions. Catholicism remains a major part of Filipino culture. English remains important in education, government, and public life. American-style political institutions continue to influence government, while Spanish and American histories remain present in memory, architecture, language, and national identity. The timeline here is that Spanish rule began in 1565. American control began in 1898, and independence from the U.S. came in 1946, but the effects of empire lasting beyond those dates. Colonialism shaped institutions and identities that continued into the post-colonial period. So the modern Philippines cannot be understood through one empire alone. It has to be understood through layers of pre-colonial communities: Spanish rule, American rule, Filipino resistance, elite collaboration, nationalism, and post-colonial state formation. In the end, the Philippines were not simply shaped by empire. Filipinos had to adapt, resist, and transform those colonial inheritances into part of their own national history. These final slides show the sources and image credits that I used for the presentation. I want to thank you all for listening to this. I had an amazing time creating, researching, and presenting this. Thank you so much. Bye.